Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my NACL Spring Split Primer and Power Rankings video. Finally, it is finally time for the NACL to start here in 2026. We, of course, did not have a winter split. They pick up their season at the beginning, or I guess at the end of March here, not quite the beginning of April. We will get some games before we turn over into the new month, but we finally get some Tier 2 action here in North America. Obviously, it still confuses me why we wait so long into the year to have official competition, but boy, am I glad for it to be back. I cannot wait to go over everything. It's been quite an eventful offseason. Obviously, some pretty big Tier 2 alumni doing well in Tier 1 at the current moment, and there's been a lot of talk about the NACL and the direction that it's heading, and so I'm just super stoked to finally be getting back to talking about this league. If you guys are excited as well, let me know down in the comment section below. What do you expect from these teams? Do you like my rankings? Do you dislike my rankings? Obviously, this is going to be at least kind of controversial. It just naturally is going to be that, because whenever you share opinions on the internet, some people are going to disagree with those opinions, but I'm curious to know what you agree with and what you disagree with in today's video. Leave that down in the comment section below. Who are your dark horses? Who do you think is overrated? All of that stuff, but I don't want to waste you guys' time too much. There's a ton to get to in today's video, a ton to talk about, and so let's get into the content itself. If you are new here, what we're going to do in these primer videos is go team by team from number 10 to number 1 in my personal power rankings, talking about every team, their expectations, their floor, their ceiling, playstyle expectations for maybe how they're going to want to put their resources, who I think could be standout players that could grow and evolve throughout the split, and we'll also be ranking and power ranking, I guess, these players individually in their own role from number 1 to number 10. So you'll know who I think is the 8th best AD carry or the 4th best jungler, right? Like I'm going to be going through that throughout every single team in this league. Now for NACL in particular, this is especially relevant, and there's going to be a lot of qualifiers for this. When I say power rankings, what I mean by power rankings specifically for the NACL, this is less so the case for the Tier 1 regions, but specifically for the NACL, this is basically a floor ranking for me. This is me ranking how confident I am that a team is either going to be good or not so good. I think that there are a lot of chances for teams to move up or down on this list, and ideally, in a perfect world, I'm completely wrong. You want to see players develop, you want to see them get better over the course of a split. I would love to, talk about some players that don't have a lot of Tier 2 experience and be hyping them up by the end of the split, talking about them as some of the best players in their role in Tier 2. That would be best case scenario for me, but generally when I'm ranking these players and when I'm ranking these teams, it's basically a confidence score. Number 10 is not a team that I think is guaranteed to get number 10, more so a team that I have less confidence in than the other teams, that I think has a lower floor than the other teams, if that makes sense. Conversely, that means teams that I think theoretically have a higher floor, even if they have a bit of a lower ceiling, might be a bit higher up on this list than maybe you'll see in other power rankings. It more so just comes down to how confident do I feel that you are at the very least going to be a solid team and a tough out in the regular season. There are some tiers that we're obviously going to break these teams up into. I think that it's very clean to kind of break these teams up, at least from my perspective, into 4 very specific tiers. That means there are going to be some big clusters, specifically the middle of the standings. You can really put them in whatever order you want. So those are the qualifiers out of the way. I feel like I have to kind of say that in these videos just to make sure I get my point across, that these rankings are not supposed to be rigid. Like, you're looking at a team that, if they're number 7 in my rankings, they could be number 5, they could be number 8 or 9, and I don't think I'll really be all that, different in terms of my opinion on those teams. It really just comes down to personal preference and just raw opinion in that area. Same thing for those players. They can be 1 or 2 or even 3 spots up or down in terms of your rankings, and I think we're probably going to be in a decently similar spot. I'll be talking about the players and my expectations for them as we go throughout this list, and that will be mostly the information and I guess the overall vibe that I want to give off. So with that out of the way, that's the preamble done. I know it's obviously long, but we have to get into that before we get into the video. Let's actually get into the video itself. Like I said, we're going from number 10 to number 1 in my personal confidence rankings for these teams, and that means starting off at number 10. This is the team that I have the least amount of confidence in of any team in the NACL. That does not mean that I think they're definitely going to get relegated. It just means that I think they have more to prove than a lot of the other teams. And right now, coming in at number 10 for me, it is going to be Dorado Gaming, obviously returning from summer last year. They have a big roster overhaul. 4 players on this team that have played in the NACL before, which I think is encouraging. That's obviously something that you want to see. You want to see players, have some level of, experience and like a floor to be able to play through. And then obviously Redemption coming in as the support here for Dorado. There's a lot to talk about with these players, especially with how they played over the back end of the year, because all 4 of the ones that ended up playing here had very different roads, and obviously Redemption had a very different road to the NACL, and I think that to me just gives them a bit of a lower floor. Even if you look at some of these player rankings and see a team that maybe grades out as like the 9th or maybe even 8th best team in the league, I just don't know if as a unit I feel comfortable ranking them number 9. I have less confidence in them than I do at the team at number 9, even if that might be a bit of a controversial ranking. So let's quickly go over what you're seeing on the screen. Of course, at the top of the screen is going to be the team name, in this case, Dorado Gaming, coming in as the number 10 team. You can see where they're ranked based on the number 10 number. I will say anything in parentheses is just going to compare where Dorado are at now versus where they were in summer. The 10 ranking is going to be -4 in this case because they finished 6th in the summer split. As for the players, you can see some parentheses numbers down there as well, +2, +1, -2, all of that stuff. That is going to indicate where this team was at in the primer that I put out before the summer split last year. Now, obviously, it's not a perfect comparison, and I think specifically this is kind of a downside of my format for NACL because rosters are naturally going to turn over, but typically I use this to kind of compare like, okay, I think you're in a better spot from a projection standpoint now than you were last year in specific spots, that kind of thing. I don't think it's quite so simple here for Dorado, obviously, or for the NACL, because you're hoping that these rosters change a lot, and maybe comparing, what Dorado's roster was last year to this year is not particularly fair, but I think it's at least something that is interesting enough for me to keep on the screen. You can, of course, see new underneath each player. I would have a player picture for, every player here. Unfortunately for the NACL, it's not always easy to find headshots. I think at the very least, the main account is doing a good job of tweeting out the teams that have been officially announced, and I think that does transition nicely as well into some of these rosters are not technically officially announced by the program just yet. I'm taking whatever it says on Liquipedia as just kind of like that. Those are the rumored rosters. That's what I imagine we're going to be going forward with. So if anything changes before like 2 days from now when the first games start, I do apologize on that as well. But that's everything you need to know about what you're seeing on the screen. We can go ahead and go over Dorado in particular and talk about why I think their floor might be quite low, even if their ceiling could theoretically be pretty high. Their lineup is looking like Decoy in the top lane, Low Jazz in the jungle, Adam in the mid lane, Hub at AD carry, and Redemption at support. Dorado obviously doing kind of an interesting thing. They were a team that was decently competitive in the summer split last year, but didn't seem like they were going to be able to retain that kind of consistency. Some of their players definitely got poached by bigger organizations, which we will talk about here in the NACL, and it feels like they just wanted to go into a direction where they were competitive, maybe giving a chance to some players who had small runtime here in the NACL, but definitely, were going to get more over the course of this split and kind of needed that second shot to see if they could perform differently in a different situation. I think you're maybe getting the best of the rest, but we'll talk about why I think there might be some concern with this. You, of course, are getting Decoy and Low Jazz from the Apex Mission Impossible team that did qualify for the NACL. They go in a different direction on the top side of the map, which is something we're going to talk about with them. You get Adam and Hub from the Cupid Esports roster, and, obviously Polestar back in the spring of last year as well. 2 players that I think showed a lot of mechanical talent and a lot of ability to play aggressive, but maybe need to get reined in a little bit, which we will talk about. And then Redemption, who's been around the tier 3 scene for a pretty long time, was decently good for Gravity over in the ACL summer playoffs, which obviously is something I'm going to bring up quite a bit for a lot of these players who weren't in tier 2 last year, and then obviously was playing for Scaling IRL in the promotion tournament here. They weren't able to get that done. But these are players that have been like around this scene for a little while. I just have individual concerns with them that I think are definitely a bit more up in the air. Low Jazz, probably the most established player on this team. Not only did he play for Apex Mission Impossible in the spring split, he requalified with AMI towards the end of last split because he was originally on Blue Otter as the starting jungler. He ends up getting replaced by Kryra, who we obviously know is a very good player. He's up in the LCS now, so he's doing pretty well for himself. But Low Jazz is able to get himself back into the NACL, and I think if you're looking for, a player that this team is likely going to play through in most games, it's probably going to be Low Jazz. I want to see Hub get a lot of resources here. We'll talk about the bot lane in a second, but Low Jazz is definitely going to be the primary option in terms of where a lot of that early game power goes to. He can be a pretty aggressive jungler, and I'm excited to see what he can do in a situation where he's probably going to be a bit more unlocked. We saw it a bit on AMI back in the day, where he obviously qualified in the spring split because of his aggressive tendencies and his ability to start fights. I think he's really smart in terms of finding creative angles to be able to engage a lot of threats. I think he is he's got that like instinct that a lot of players just don't have, where they can just see the angles and see the ways to be aggressive that maybe won't get them punished nearly as much. I think LoJazz is good at that. The big problem for LoJazz has been the same problem that most tier 2 junglers struggle with if they're not exactly the most consistent in the world, and that's that he's not particularly good at playing from behind. He will let games snowball out of control really fast, and he is going to give over resources. He's going to over aggress and, you know, basically give free stats over to the enemy team, free kills over to the enemy team. Some of the fights that he does engage aren't always the most consistent. He will find super creative angles, but if they don't work out, he can actually put his team at a pretty big deficit, basically completely isolated, because he will let games get a bit out of control. Outside of that, though, he is obviously a very good player. And, you know, I think people are going to be looking at LoJazz as somebody who can really be kind of the leader for this team. Decoy and Adam, I think, are two solo laners that I have some more optimism about. Adam, I want to talk about first because it's both a positive and a negative conversation. I mean, when we were talking about Adam in the NACL, we were basically just talking about somebody who had no inhibition, who was going to fight all the time and constantly look to win the game. You were going to see games where Adam was either, you know, ahead and in a good spot to be able to carry, or really far behind. There really was no middle ground for Adam as a player, and I think that has really not changed, and I would expect that to be the case, and I think that's why there's going to be more pressure put in the mid lane here. We'll talk about the bot lane again in a second, because I think Hub is actually a really interesting AD carry that I want to see get a little bit more run here, but Adam as a mid laner just kind of necessitates more jungle intervention because the game is usually either won or lost through the mid lane. Now, part of that was because Polestar didn't have a ton of other avenues in tier 2 at the very least to be able to win games super consistently, but we saw it on Cupid as well in the qualification for this tournament, or for the NACL last year, where I think Adam is just a player that needs to rein it in a little bit, that needs to be able to judge these situations a little bit more accurately. You're going to get some gold leads because Adam is a very mechanically talented player, but again, I think that there is a lot of development in terms of when to take fights and how to take fights that, you know, theoretically should be able to be improved. I think that there is a chance that Adam continues to really struggle. Adam had a really tough run of things, in my opinion, in tier 2 the last time he played here in spring of last year, but if they can start to figure out some of the, I guess, nuances of the position, and obviously mid lane is a position that we're going to talk about a bit later, is a little bit less proven right now. There are very few players that I think are guaranteed to be great. If Adam can break through and be like a borderline top 7-ish mid laner, I think that does raise what Dorado can do, and that's probably the avenue towards them getting out of some of these bottom 2 spots that I'm kind of projecting for them. Decoy is another player I'm pretty excited about on the top side. I actually really like Decoy. I think Decoy has a lot of really interesting traits, not scared to play weak side, which I think is kind of rare here for tier 2 top laners. You can put Decoy on an island and they're going to do just fine, but I think they can carry in a really interesting way in that same vein. Again, qualified through AMI, but ends up coming over here to Dorado. I don't necessarily like that move for AMI. I think Decoy is a really strong player, and I don't know if it was just, I don't know whose decision it was, right? Like LoJazz, obviously a player that I think could have helped that team out in the same vein, but Decoy I think is a good get for Dorado because of the flexibility that they offer. That adds on to the idea that I think this bot lane is actually going to be a little bit better than people think it's going to be. I liked Hub when Polestar was playing in the NACL last year. Hub has continued to impress me when I watch these like smaller tournaments, the ACL and obviously the qualification series with Cupid. I really do think that Hub is an interesting player, and to me, I think you want to play for bot lane if you are this team. Redemption, a player that has had a lot of run at tier 3, has been very close to the tier 2 scene for a pretty long time. Of course, most recently, at least the tape that I'm pulling off of, is going to be the scaling tape, and then of course the gravity tape from ACL last year. But Redemption has been, you know, around the block. I commentated a couple of Redemption's games during the open qualifiers last year as well in the support position. So you're generally just looking at a bot lane that I think could be the focal point, could play strong side a little bit more, especially because you're looking at a top side that I don't think is all that scared of playing. Weak side can still carry, but isn't all that scared. The question is, like, can you play anywhere other than for Adam? Because Adam is so flippy individually as a mid laner, and LoJazz is going to want a lot of resources themselves. So this is a team that I think has some upside. I think the individual players here can be interesting. How do I think they come together? I'm really not sure. I think the most likely outcome is that this bot lane ends up taking more of a weak side role. Decoy, you know, perhaps can get strong side or weak side, and Adam is probably going to be kind of the focal point for a lot of aggression. This mid-jungle duo will likely determine whether or not Dorado can get top 8 and kind of stay out of that bottom 2, stay out of that relegation conversation. For now, I'm not necessarily super comfortable on saying that that's going to happen. That's why they come in number 10 for me, but as one of the 2 teams that I think are kind of, you know, in that bottom tier, I think 10 and 9 are very close to each other. Dorado, I think, has the opportunity to continue to grow, and I like that a lot of these players are getting some second chances after not having the best situations in their first time in the NACL. Then moving on to number 9 in my power rankings, and this is a team I think a lot of people are going to have at number 10, and while I do think that there is a bottom 2, I don't quite have this team's floor as low as I do Dorado's, although I think it is relatively close. It's Apex Mission Impossible for me coming in at number 9. They, of course, qualify through the promotion tournament, last split being able to take Vancouver Impact's spot in the NACL here as CCG re-qualify through their own spot, but for the most part, this team is basically unchanged from that promotion tournament. I really do think that even though on paper you might look at these numbers and see like, okay, well, they're number 9 in basically every role except for mid lane where they're number 10, like this team has a very low floor. I think that there is something here, not only in terms of the continuity, but in terms of some of the individual players that I think gives you more upside, in my opinion, and to me is more interesting than what we just talked about with Dorado, although I think it is very close. Like, I don't think it's like a blow away. AMI is clearly number 9 and Dorado's clearly number 10. I just kind of like AMI, I think, a bit more than other people, and this is me kind of putting them out of number 10 and seeing if that ends up paying off. So let's go ahead and talk about it, their lineup, and if I pronounce any names wrong, again, let me know. I don't get to watch a lot of these games with commentary on because I have to watch so many of them, not only for tier 1 and tier 2, but tier 3 as well. So any pronunciation errors, just let me know down in the comment section below. It's going to be Arbrio in the top lane, Bio in the jungle, Retrozing in the mid lane, Baz at AD carry, and Protoss at support. Obviously, this is a team with a lot of players that people are going to be decently familiar with from AMI throughout, multiple times. I think you're looking at Baz, obviously, is the main piece that's coming back from the AMI run in the spring split of last year when that team was in the NACL qualifying through the open qualifiers, and Baz was a really good player. One of the reasons I am a little bit more optimistic about this team is because I think this bot lane has been really fun to watch, but the reason I also talk about the chemistry is because at least 4 of these 5 players played together in the ACL playoffs, which is really encouraging. Arbrio is obviously a new player coming in from the qualification series, but Arbrio was playing for this team in the ACL. Bio is technically the only new player from the most recent tournament that AMI ended up running, replacing Lojaz, kind of swapping places, I guess, with Lojaz, going from Cupid to Cupid kind of turning into Dorado, and then obviously AMI, all of that stuff. You guys understand what I mean when I say Bio and Lojaz kind of swapped spots here, but I kind of like Bio a little bit more in terms of upside. Lojaz, I think, is a really good player, and Lojaz certainly has a higher floor, but Bio, I think, has some really interesting, traits in the jungle as well. So I think when you're looking at this team in terms of, where they're going to put their energy, Bio and Baz, I think, are the 2 players you have to watch out for. Baz is a really good team fighter in the later part of the game. I think laning can be a bit inconsistent for Baz, at least from what I've seen. One of the reasons I really like that is Protoss, which we are going to talk about. Protoss, a very meta player right now, we'll just say. Like, I think Protoss is somebody who does enjoy to play a lot of enchanters, wants to play Karma, wants to play Janna, champions like that a lot of other people are not necessarily bringing out. I think that could really help the 2v2, because Baz, if you can enable Baz in the later part of games, we even saw in the NACL last year that there are games that can be won by Baz, just purely off of the way that they go about positioning and the aggressiveness that they show in team fights. Baz is not scared of being able to take over in the big moment. And I think if you can get that bot lane to be good in the early game, if you're not falling behind, 30, 40 CS like we saw from AMI throughout a lot of the spring split, then I actually think things can be pretty good. I think they're going to draft pretty aggressively for the bottom side of the map here and really try to get Baz into a good position if Protoss does want to play, more enchanters, which I kind of expect to be the case. Protoss can play engagers. I'm not trying to, knock anything else here and say that Protoss is like a one trick for enchanters or anything like that, but it's clear that I think Protoss prefers to play a lot of enchanters from what I've seen, and I think that does play into the meta really well. I think if you can play enchanters at a really high level, you're probably going to be better in 2026 than if you're just like an engager player, as we've seen from, globally from a lot of the teams that have found success this year. A lot of them are more than willing to try and play these positive 2v2 bot lanes in lane and be able to transition that into a more stable late game somewhere else on the map. I think this team is kind of well positioned to do so. Bio is also a player that I think is relatively underrated in the community right now. I really like Bio as a jungler. I think that there is like a non-zero chance that Bio can turn into like a top 5 or so jungler this split if it ends up really working out. I'm not going to say that that's, perfect or like guaranteed or anything like that, that there's no way that Bio's floor is low. Again, Bio comes in 1 spot below Lojaz, and I just talked about Lojaz being a relatively, inconsistent player in terms of being able to, generate resources and not give over resources to the enemy team. Bio doesn't, I think, have the most consistent, game plans in the world, as you're going to see from a lot of the junglers lower on in the tier list here. But what I think Bio has going for them is the ability to generate leads. I think more so than most other junglers at this level. I think Bio is really aggressive in terms of how they push the tempo, how they want to keep the game going, and Generally, I think if Bio wants to choose to go towards bot lane, if Baz and Protoss are going to be kind of the main characters in terms of the early game, and Bio can kind of play for that, I think that's actually a really big positive for AMI. I think where you do start to get a bit concerned is Arbrio and Retrozing. Retrozing, obviously, somebody who's been playing with this team for a little while now in the mid lane. Fimini was their mid laner, throughout the spring split last year. Fimini obviously going on to a very different team that we're going to talk about much, much later in this video. But Retrozing, I do have some concerns about. Kind of your standard mid. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say that there's anything that stands out on tape in like an overly massive way. I think Retrozing plays the map pretty well. Decent shove and roam mid laner, which I think does play into the idea of Bio being a bit more aggressive. Usually one of your jungler or your mid laner kind of has to be more of a main character that wants to take resources. In this case, I do think that will be Bio, but Retrozing I think can play a lot of the, shove and roam, Rise, Talia, Galio type of champions, and I think, fit into that role well. Typically when you see them on carries, they're going to be fine enough in these late game team fights. I didn't see anything that was particularly amazing out of my tape, but maybe there is something in here. It's really cool to see this team kind of sticking with Retrozing, not going in a different direction with Bio coming in into the mid or into the jungle. I think you want a more aggressive jungler next to Retro, but we'll see how that ends up turning out. And then Arbrio on the top side, much more aggressive as a top laner as well. I think this is naturally what you're going to see out of a lot of tier 3 top laners. Prefers to play more aggressive matchups. The Camille kind of stands out to me as something that we saw quite a bit, but Aatrox, Gwen, things like that. The countering tanks, that is kind of the idea for Arbrio, playing a bit more strong side. That does concern me a bit because I do think this team is kind of set up to play more towards bot side with Retrozing wanting to roam a bit more. We'll see how Arbrio can kind of meld into a lot of what this team wants to do at the tier 2 level. I think weak side is necessary for top lane in the current meta. I think you have to be able to survive in the 1v1 even if you're not in a more aggressive matchup. We just don't really have a lot of tape on Arbrio that would suggest that that is or isn't going to happen, so I don't really want to make any assertions onto that just yet, but generally, I think the solo laners, if they're going to be good enough to survive at this level, Bio, I think, is a good jungler, and I think this bot lane could actually be pretty good, sneakily pretty good if things end up working out, and that's why I have this team at number 9 instead of number 10. I also think that there is a world where there are too many cooks and that you just have a lot of players that are very used to being main characters and that they don't have the mechanical, skill to be able to capitalize on their playstyle at the tier 2 level quite in the same way that they would at the tier 3 level. All of that is possible for this team, but I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt because I think they overperformed this organization, and quite a few of these players overperformed when we saw them, last, not only obviously in the ACL, but, when we're talking about the NACL and Spring Split last year, Baz was a player that really impressed me. Bio was a player on Pulse that really impressed me. Protoss is a player that I'm decently high on in terms of where I kind of view the floor in terms of the skill set. AMI is a team that I genuinely think can have a pretty big, surprise run. I'm not going to say they're guaranteed to be out of bottom 2. I do think they're in that bottom 2 cluster, but if this team finished 7th or 8th, I don't think I'm going to be all that surprised, and I don't think you should be either. But then moving on to number 8 in my power rankings, and a team that I think I definitely have a lot lower than others, it would seem, in terms of these rankings. I've seen pretty consensus, this team around 6th or 5th in people's rankings. They come in at number 8 for me because the floor is just a little lower. It's CCG Esports. And again, this is kind of where you start to have this conversation. I think this is where the tier jump is. Bottom 2 are very clearly like the D tier, the bottom tier here in the NACL. But then you start getting into the C tier, and 5 to 8, I think as teams are all basically identical from my perspective in terms of what you can have the expectation at. I just think that there are some major question marks for me when it comes to CCG that it doesn't seem like others have. Maybe I'm just not plugged in enough. Obviously, there's been a lot of conversation and talk about how this team is super synergistic and how they're super locked in and all these players really wanted to play together, and that's really exciting, and I think that that could very much work out. Having that inbuilt chemistry and synergy to be able to overcome the bad situations is like the most important thing you can have as a team in tier 2, because there's going to be negative moments. It's really just about who responds well. I just think that there are some major questions for me about individual player skill, or at least where some players might be at in terms of their actual production. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Fiji in the top lane, Dardoch in the jungle, Aljun in the mid lane, Cody Sun at AD carry, and only 35 at support. Of course, some very familiar names here, and finally we get a roster with mostly pictures up on the screen. We're going to have that throughout the rest of the video. In fact, I think it's going to be basically all of the rest of the video where the rest of the teams will have actual player pictures. Just kind of tough for the bottom 2 teams that have either not been officially announced in Dorado's case, so they don't have an NACL graphic, or alternatively for AMI, they just don't have a lot of player portraits for Apex Mission Impossible. But CCG finally getting into the player headshots category, which is really fun. I just think that there are some big worries for me about some playstyle differences between some players here. Specifically, you're looking at Dardoch being kind of the big leader and mentor of this team, coming off of a really good run with Supernova at the end of last year. Of course, this is somebody who's familiar with this organization, who came in here, basically handpicked his mid laner, wanted to play with Aojun, wanted to play with Cody's son, who's obviously coming back to professional play. That's going to be a pretty major conversation that we have. But Dardoch is kind of the piece that if you want to talk about this team being closer to number 5 or number 6 in the rankings, it's probably going to be because you have more faith in Dardoch than, not that I do, just that I think the floor here is actually a little lower than people think it is. Dardoch, I think, has found a majority of his success when he gets to play super aggressive. I really don't find Dardoch's playstyle all that dissimilar to someone like Contracts up in the LCS, where he really wants pushing lanes. He wants the ability to be able to go out there and kind of strangle the enemy team out of their own individual game. He is really successful at being able to play slower. He can, get into that spot where he wants to play more for skirmishes and allow the enemy teams to make mistakes, but I don't think that's necessarily when he's at his best. I think he's at his best when he gets to control the tempo and when he gets to dictate kind of the direction that the game gets to go into, and I think that style inherently just relies on your team being in good positions and your draft being more aggressive in the early game. And while I think you can have some optimism that can be the case here for CCG, I'm not quite sure you're getting the exact same Dardoch that you got in 2025 and 2026 with this kind of roster. I think that there is some worry that style is just going to be punishable a bit more. We saw Dardoch for multiple years, many years, on mid to lower tier NACL teams or top tier 3 teams not really be able to find that same level of success because it's just a lot more difficult to play that style if your laners aren't consistently able to generate gold and resources individually in their own matchups. Again, I still feel pretty good about Dardoch. He's coming in as my number 4 jungler in the NACL, like in the league, just in total. I still think that he is a really big piece, and if this team is going to succeed, it's because Dardoch is going to continue to be a top, 2 all-pro kind of jungler, but I would expect some natural regression from the way that things ended with Supernova just because of the way that the rest of this team is set up. And I think that plays nicely into maybe some of the concerns that I have elsewhere. We'll talk about bot lane after. I want to talk about Aojun first because I think that is probably the biggest conversation for me to have. I really like Aojun's tier 3 tape. I think it's really solid. He shows a lot of ability to be able to play the map well, does seem to be decently consistent at being able to survive in lane and be a strong team fighter if need be. The problem I have with Aojun is that I really did not like the tier 2 tape last year. I thought it was quite bad. The laning phase was really not good. He just was not surviving in the 1v1, and we were seeing a lot of situations where games would kind of tumble themselves out of control because you just lose mid priority so quickly for CCG. That was a big reason why I think this org went into a different direction entirely for their roster going into the second half of the year. It's just because Aojun, I think, was inconsistent. That is the verbiage that I definitely want to use. There were good games from Aojun, and what we saw, I said this a lot when we were talking about the NACL last year. When Aojun was winning or when he was neutral in lane, CCG actually had a ton of success as a team, but on almost every single one of their losses, when you looked back at those games, Aojun was behind in tempo and they were really pushing through the middle of the map to be able to spread out and beat CCG elsewhere. I think there's optimism that obviously in year 2, Aojun can get better, but it was a tough start in year 1, and I think it's tougher than people are giving it credit for, and I don't know if it's just going to be like a click and fix kind of thing. I don't know if bringing Dardoch in and obviously having the vibes is just going to make things better for Aojun. I think he has the talent to be a really good mid laner at this level, and I'll talk about it again even a bit more in this section and more later on in the video. Mid lane is not an established position. You can be a top 5 mid laner being super inconsistent right now in terms of where the NACL is at. Maybe even better than that, because I think there's really only like 2 or 3 established great mid laners in the NACL right now. But Aojun, I think, has the potential to be high. It's just, again, low floor, especially with what we've seen at the tier 2 level. That's when we get into Cody's son and only 35. How do you even have a conversation about what Cody's son is going to be? This is similar to how I talked about the Conviction roster from last year, where so many of these players are just coming back to pro. We hadn't seen Evolved. We hadn't seen Perry. We hadn't seen, a Viper playing AD carry. We just had no real, actual tape to kind of determine where these players are at. Cody's son is in a very similar spot, ironic considering he obviously subbed in for Conviction during the promotion tournament last year, and that is the most amount of AD carry tape that we have of Cody's son since 2022. He was playing in the LFL back in 2022. He wasn't very good in the LFL in 2022. Last time he played in North America full-time in Tier 2 was TSM Academy back in 2021, and he was also fine back in 2021. I have a lot of grades from him back in the day that are just really average. I don't know what to expect. Cody's son, a very aggressive player, and, theoretically he fits well with Dardoch, and we've talked about this previously. I mean, former Dardoch teammate back on Immortals, I want to say back in 2017, somewhere around that time before Dardoch ended up going, I believe, to CLG after that. Dardoch obviously has a very crazy career, but these two have played together in the LCS before. Cody's clearly wanted to play with the rest of this team. It's clear that this was kind of the direction that he wanted to come back to pro in. It's just hard for me to say that his floor is any higher than like the 8th best AD carry in the league, because I think ADC is actually a relatively good position here in the NACL. And Cody's a very aggressive laner. If he can generate leads, especially with only 35, who I think is also a very kind of feast or famine type of support, that can be really good. But again, only 35 is not exactly the most stable support in the world. I like only 35. In fact, I like him more than almost anybody else on this team in terms of his floor. He comes in as my number 6 support. I think support, while it's an okay position here in the NACL, has some room for improvement, but only 35 will have some bad games. And I think generally you can sometimes see him just not have as much of an impact on the map as maybe you would want when he loses in lane. I think this team kind of needs to win in the 2v2 in order to find success, because Aljun, while I'm hopeful that he can turn into a stable enough laner to be able to play through the mid to late game, that was not the case last time. And Fiji is just a major question mark on the top side. So I think there's just a lot of responsibility on Cody and only 35 to be able to win in the 2v2. Very possible for it to happen. But again, I think CCG needs it to happen, which is why their floor is a little bit lower. And then we can talk a bit about Fiji on the top side. Fiji, a player that CCG clearly likes, was a part of this roster during the ACL when they were kind of playing, I don't want to say it was clear that a lot of teams were trying out a lot of their rosters, but Fiji getting the go-ahead to be the starting top laner here. I think Fiji's decently flexible. We're seeing quite a bit of, weak side top lane coming into the league, which I think is really important. Unfortunately for Fiji, I just don't really have a lot of tape to go and say like, oh, you're going to be able to carry games at this level. I think it's more likely that this team almost entirely ignores topside for the beginning part of the year and just plays for Cody and only 35 to be a bit more consistent, and hopefully for Aljun to be able to survive laning phase a bit more. I did like Fiji when we saw, Sion and, some of these more weak side picks. That is what we've seen so far out of the tape, at least from my opinion, to say like, okay, Fiji's an interesting player in that regard. And I think, like I said earlier, you kind of need to play weak side top lane right now to be a good top laner in the current meta, because there's just not a lot of, reasons to play towards top side, quite frankly, on the map right now. So if you can't play weak side, you're just less valuable as a player. But I think Fiji can fill that role and, theoretically shouldn't be too much of a weak link for this team. But again, it's just introducing another variable that I think lowers the floor of this team. If you want to talk about upside, the upside is, again, clear that they can be a top 5 or top 6 team, especially with the vibes that are currently surrounding this roster. But I think that there are some major issues for me, which drop them down to number 8. Dardoch basically needs to be a top 3 jungler in the NACL in order for this roster to work. I think Cody and only 35 have to win in the 2v2 more often than not in order for this team to be able to play through. You're looking for that development from Aljun. You're hoping you get something out of Fiji that maybe is not as clear to me right now on the top side. Like, that's so many questions for CCG that I don't really have about teams that are above them, or at least I have less questions about the teams that are above them. So while I do think this team can find a lot of success, I think it needs to be proven on the Rift before I just blindly go in and believe that they're going to be a team that competes to be like near the upper echelon of the middle of the pack here. Then moving on to number 7 in my power rankings, and this is a team that I honestly have a lot of confidence and faith in. I just don't really have the balls right now to put them above number 7 in my rankings. It's Winthrop University. I really think that there is a chance and a world where this team is top 5 again and just continues to overperform, mostly because I really just believe in mobility down on the bottom side of the map, but there are some question marks elsewhere on the roster for me that just bring the floor of this team down a little bit, even if I really do think the upside of this team is absolutely massive, and there are some pieces that I was really impressed on last year. There's a couple of roster changes that I'm not exactly the biggest fan of that we're going to talk about, and generally, I think there's just this idea that you rely too much on a player that, isn't going to have the chance to carry every single game with the playstyle that Winthrop want to go to. But if everything else can work out, I do think that there is an avenue for Winthrop to be like a top 5 team. And originally I had them top 5 until there was a last minute roster change here in the mid lane, which we're going to talk about. It just lowers the floor a little bit for me. But let's go ahead and talk about Winthrop. Their lineup is looking like Denethor in the top lane, Wilson or Trickster or whatever tag he's still going by in the jungle, Conveying, also known as Papa, in the mid lane, Mobility at AD carry, and Kim Down at support. I do believe he's going by Conveying, by the way, in the mid lane from everything that I've seen instead of Papa. I'm going to call him Conveying. If it's Papa, I'm sorry. We'll change it obviously for the actual NACL coverage. It's just what I believe. I've heard he's going by, at least going into the rest of the NACL year, but talking about Winthrop, you start and end the conversation with Mobility. Down on the bottom side, he obviously got a small run in the LCS lock-in tournament for Dignitas when him and Breezy went up to fill some spots that FBI and Ignar weren't ready for yet with the visa situation. That's really cool for him to be able to get the LCS spot over a lot of other tier 2 AD carries that I think were in, positions where they could fill in, relatively efficiently. For Mobility to be a player that an LCS team thought was good enough to survive at that level is really solid. We didn't exactly see the best gameplay in the entire universe from Mobility, but generally, I was so impressed last year with the way that Mobility was able to play that I'm willing to just kind of go all in here. I think AD carry at the top end, at least of the rankings, is a position that has a pretty big opening after number 1 in terms of the NACL rankings. And quite frankly, I think Mobility's gameplay and just the flexibility that he offers as an ADC is so valuable that to me, he comes in as number 2. And maybe that's me overreaching and giving too much credit to this player, but I really do think he is a game changer. And that's why I think this team can be like a top 5, top half team in the NACL basically from day number 1, is I really think they have a difference maker in the AD carry role. If he grows even more from what he was last year, that's incredible. What I was super impressed by when you compare him to a lot of the other like superstar C-lol AD carries that, you know, didn't quite find the same level of success like Shogo last year in the NACL, is that he's just so flexible with the way he can play the game. If you need him to be a late game carry, he can do that. He can be a hyper carry. It's not exactly what he's most comfortable on, but he can do that. If you need him to play a lane dominant pick that wins in the 2v2 and moves around and fights a lot in the mid game, he can do that relatively well. It's something he feels comfortable doing. If you need him to play weak side AD carry, that's probably his bread and butter, is, you know, getting something like Jin and just playing on weak side and feeling comfortable doing whatever he needs to do. I just really like the ability to do whatever is needed out of a player in the AD carry role right now, because I think your jungle mid kind of needs to take priority in a lot of cases when you're drafting. And if you can save a lot of those bot lane picks, if you don't feel forced into trying to get a winning 2v2 or a scaling pick down on the bottom side in order to play to your player's strengths, I think it opens up so many more options for the way that your team can play the game. So I think Mobility fits into this meta well. I think his mechanics are excellent. If he can just get a little bit more stable in the 2v2, I think things are going to get really, really good. Because again, the biggest issue I have with Mobility is that he sometimes doesn't press his advantages enough, or at least that was the case in tier 2 last year. I would love to see more of a killer mentality, but again, from a flexibility standpoint, he might be the most flexible AD carry in the entire NACL, which is really, really a plus for me. You're pairing him with Kim Down. This is one of the new players coming in from last year at the very least. I'm not exactly sure that this is an upgrade or a downgrade. I've never been the biggest fan of Kim Down. I think generally he's an okay support at this level and should be somebody that can help Mobility, hopefully in the 2v2. We've seen him have some really good performances in the 2v2 in the past, and I think that would be the idea if you want to be optimistic about how this can work out. I think Kim Down coming in and being somebody that can really help Mobility in the early game and just get him into the mid game where he skirmishes incredibly well, get him into the late game where he's really smart in team fights. That would be, you know, pretty massive for this team. I don't think he's quite as aggressive as Only 35 was. I think he's much more passive in terms of the way he plays the game, but I do think he's more stable. You're not going to have as many like terrible performances, in my opinion, as maybe you had with Only 35. Not that he had terrible games, just that he can be more of a feast or famine support. He can have great games, he can have bad games. It's just kind of the way his career has always gone. Kim Down, I think, gives you more stability, even if the upside is generally a little lower. And then you get to the top side of the map, Denethor and Wilson. I was really impressed by Denethor down the stretch of last year. He was a player that I never really bought into like on a full level throughout a majority of 2025, but I think something clicked for me towards the end of 2025 where it's like, okay, I think you're starting to get more comfortable playing the 1v1s and generating your resources. I think one of the big concerns for me was that he is so explosive in late game team fights. Like if he can find those flank angles, if he's playing these more aggro picks like the Camille on the top side, you can see so many of these like standout highlight plays. But there are going to be other moments where you're just not getting quite as many, you know, resources from the top side of your map, and he can lose in the 1v1. I think I would rather have a player like this that can generate his own advantages. He can play weak side, and I think that did develop, but it really came down to him just saying, okay, I'm going to be better at being able to play the 1v1 than I was earlier this year. He clearly put a lot of time and effort into getting more comfortable playing against, you know, the top tier top laners at this level, and I think by the end of the year, he felt like a pretty complete player, even if he was somebody that did want more resources on the top side. Would still love him to get better on weak side. Generally, I think that's always been a bit of a weakness of his, but I like Denethor, and I think for being kind of the long-standing player here on the Winthrop version of the NACL team, he definitely kind of has made his mark and has kind of proven himself to be a tier 2 caliber top laner. Wilson in the jungle, I'm a little bit less sold on. Not that I think Wilson's a bad player, trickster, whatever you want to go by. I just think he's inconsistent. You're going to, again, see some pretty bad games out of Wilson generally. The good games are still very good, and I think we got more good games towards the end of the year when Winthrop was really starting to click. Again, you wanted to see them be a bit better in summer, considering how their spring split ended up going with, you know, the near airport series and everything like that. But Wilson, I think, is the kind of player that I'm still waiting to see if that step up can happen. For now, I think he's a slightly below average jungler at this level in terms of what we've seen. Hopefully that can end up changing. For now, it's just not the most exciting jungle bring back, but he is definitely a pillar, I think, of a lot of the macro that this team ends up going towards. That's probably the word I want to use, a pillar of the way that this team likes to play out their early games. And if he can just stabilize in the jungle and not give over so many resources, not have so many feast or famine games, I think that will be better. But you do have somebody coming into the mid lane that I think gives you some conversation, right? And that's Conveying or Papa or whatever he's going by. I don't hate this for Winthrop. I would definitely prefer Sword in this spot. It does look like Conveying is going to be the starting mid laner, even though, Liquipedia has Sword listed as the starter. There have been a lot of conversations online from multiple people involved in the scene about the rosters that are coming out. It does look like he is going to be starting in the mid lane. Very specific player, a really strong laner, and somebody who can generate a lot of advantages in the 1v1. Really not a good late game player. Can have a lot of problems in that phase. But honestly, going and watching a lot of the tape for Papa when he was playing with a very similar version of this roster in the ACL, I was really impressed. I actually think the floor is kind of there for Conveying to be a solid enough mid laner day number one. Especially because I don't think a lot of the mid laners at this level are as good in the laning phase. Even mid laners that are going to be slightly above him in these rankings. I'm going to spoil some of the rankings a bit. I'm not going to give full numbers, but players like Aojun, players like Phi Mini, that Zero that we're going to talk about a bit later on into this list. Like Conveying might be the best of them in terms of laning, like the actual just straight up 1v1ing. It's just everything else that I think he needs to work on as a player. He gets caught out a lot in the late game. He's not always in the right place at the right time. He has overly aggressive tendencies in side lanes to get caught out. Think of him as like a less developed, obviously, version of someone like Saint up in the LCS, where he's just going to make a lot of mistakes, even if he has a gold lead in the later part of the game. You're just hopeful that you can start to rein that in, especially for a player who's never played at the tier 2 level before. If you can get, some good development under him, and if you can get him into a spot where he can take those gold leads and move it to the rest of the map, move it to Wilson, move it to mobility, move it to Denethor, and be able to use that side lane pressure to play a lot of these fights more efficiently, that's really, really good for Winthrop. And I think it does open up the door for this team to be successful. I just think the floor becomes lower. If this was Sword really impressed me last year. I actually came out of last year feeling great about Sword as a mid laner, and I would still prefer Sword be starting here in the mid lane spot just because I think it gives you less uncertainty. But Conveying does have some upside. I think Denethor can even still get better in terms of being able to unlock that ability to carry on the top side. Mobility, I think, is genuinely like a star in the making. I think that there are pieces here for Winthrop that feel really strong, that give them the potential to have high upside. There are just other pieces that I think give them a little bit of a lower floor. Kim Down is, a bit of a question mark. I've never been the biggest fan of Wilson, and you don't really know what you're getting out of Conveying. Denethor can still lose games on the top side, and Mobility isn't exactly the most dominant AD carry, even if I think his skill set is pretty valuable towards the game as a whole right now. Winthrop are just in a spot where they're right on the edge of being a team that I think could really compete, but another team that I wouldn't be surprised if they were a lot better or at least a lot more competitive against top-tier teams than people think they will be. Then moving on to number 6 in my power rankings, and this is a team I desperately wanted to rank at number 5. I really do think the upside of this team is the most of any team in this like middle of the pack, 5 to 8 tier, but again, the floor is just a little low to me because of a couple of things. It's Blue Otter coming in at number 6. Boy, do I want this team at number 5. Boy, do I think this is the team out of the grouping of 4 in this zone that has the highest chance of being able to break through and be a top 4 team. I think that the upside of Blue Otter is massive in terms of what this roster looks like and in terms of the best case scenario out of a lot of these players. But right now, I am just a bit concerned that we are not going to get, the guaranteed version of that. And that's why for me, they come in at number 6. Again, if you want them at number 5, I really want them at number 5. I promise you I want them at number 5, but there are some question marks and some concerns for me about whether or not we are going to get that. So let's go ahead and go over their roster. Their lineup is looking like Ariana in the top lane, Munchie in the jungle, Samakin in the mid lane, Spawn at AD carry, and Rovex at support. There's just so much to like about this team if you can get over the fact that there are some major question marks about this team. And again, with it being a floor ranking, I just can't put them higher than 6 in these rankings. I really want to put them number 5 because the upside on this team, and I think the core of this team is really good, especially in some roles that I think are relatively weak, notably mid lane. Samakin, obviously a player that has had some ups and downs in terms of tier 2 success. When this team had low jazz last year, you're talking about Samakin not being a particularly successful mid laner because he's somebody who kind of relies on his jungler having more pressure. When this team brought Kryra in, and obviously when this team had other pieces in the jungle in previous years, when Music was here and when they were finding success with other players, Samakin was super good at this level, or at the very least was consistent at this level. You're getting a really good performance, and I think this meta is really good for Samakin. Samakin, who's always preferred these AP mages, somebody who's wanted to be more of a team fighter in terms of the way he structures his games. This is the exact meta that you want to play for Samakin in the mid lane, and I think specifically because, like I said, there's really only like 2 or 3 established, like very very good mid laners at this level, and even then, like, one of them is coming off of a break. You know, Samikin being an upper half mid laner is pretty much like kind of locked in for me. I think I would be surprised if he's not a top half mid laner. I have him at number 4 in terms of these mid lane rankings right now, and I think that that is an upgrade over where he was last year, if only because I think the team surrounding him should be better. Now, there are some questions with Munchie and whether or not that's going to be good enough with Samikin to allow him to be, you know, what he wants to be, because he's not necessarily the most dominant 1v1 player in the world. He doesn't generate a ton of resources isolated. He's just really consistent in the way that he plays the game. Those are questions I'll answer a bit later, because again, for Samikin, I think in terms of weaker mid laners, I think he could be the kind of player that really elevates his game because of that. Not that he's a weak player, just that I think he's the kind of player that's been around an average mid laner at this level, and I think he could be better than that this split because of the surrounding field being less consistent. And then I really like this bot lane. Spawn and Rovex, you guys know I've always been a pretty big fan of Spawn. I'm not exactly in like the strongest spot on Spawn, as at least nearly as strong as I was before. Spawn is obviously a player that I like, but I'm not going to sit here and say that I think he's like a game breaker at this point. He never really was like a game breaker. One of the things I really liked about Spawn was his versatility. He was the best weak side AD carry, maybe even like in North America for a decently long time. He just could not play strong side. This is not somebody you really wanted to try and dominate the 2v2. He was super consistent in late game team fights and really never made a ton of like positioning mistakes, but wasn't somebody that was going to open up the game and get these like 30, 40 CS leads down on the bottom side. I think that still works for Blue Otter, but they need more pressure out of the top side. And we're going to talk about that with Ariana. I have a lot of optimism around Ariana as a player and about that being a better situation. Maybe not than last year, because I really like Quacker, but a better situation generally than maybe like some people are going to give it credit for. But Spawn, very stable as an AD carry, should offer a lot of floor to this team, and paired up with Rovex, I think this actually is a pretty good idea for a bot lane. Rovex, somebody that is a little bit more of a playmaker, does want to be a bit more aggressive. I really like Rovex as a player. I've always really liked Rovex on this team as a player, but what I really like about the pairing with Spawn in particular is this is one of the few teams in the league that I think genuinely can play entirely towards a weak side bot lane and allow Rovex to roam and move around the map. That's not something that I find to be super consistent in this current meta, because it's really hard to protect your AD carries, but Spawn is really one of the more stable ADCs at the tier 2 level. He's not somebody that's going to get exploited or make like crazy game-ending mistakes. I think Spawn's best quality is that he really doesn't make a ton of mistakes as a player, even if he also doesn't like pop off in the same kind of way that other AD carries can. Rovex is going to be free, I think, on this team to move around the map, to be able to play alongside Munchie and hopefully make that jungle and macro situation a little bit more consistent, because that is your big concern. But if Rovex is essentially like a second jungler for this team, like I think they could be structured to do, playing more for Samikin, getting him into these spots where he can team fight in the later part of the game, really playing for the solo laners more in general. I think I actually really like that idea for Blue Otter, and I don't know if there are a lot of other teams in the league that can even really do that, and more importantly, can really even stop that in terms of the pressure that's being put on the other parts of the map. So playstyle-wise, I really like that for Blue Otter. The question becomes like, okay, is this topside good enough to be able to facilitate that kind of playstyle and that kind of game plan? I believe Ariana is. I really like Ariana as a carry topside player, as a strong side topside player, and I think that is what we're going to get here on Blue Otter. I think Ariana is actually the lane that I would expect this team to play for the most. Again, I don't really love the idea of building a topside-focused team in 2026, just with the way that the meta has broken down, but man, if you can get that going, and if Ariana can take that next leap in 2026, we could be seeing some really fun top lane play coming out of this player who I thought had a really good rookie year on Dorado last year. I really like the way that Ariana plays lane, and I think when he does have a lead, all of a sudden the team fights do look a lot more consistent. I don't think everything is perfect on the top side, but the mechanical talent is definitely there. The ability to generate leads in the 1v1 is definitely there, and the ability to take those leads and translate them into, you know, solid mid to late games is also there. It's just about adding that consistency and allowing him to be somebody that is a little bit more, I don't want to say protected, but give him the knowledge and the confidence that he can be empowered to go out there and win lane, because you don't really need to protect Samikin or Spawn. They're two of the more stable players in the entire league. The big question here is Munchie, who's coming in as my number 10 jungler. This is a bit of a concern for me, right? Munchie is just super unproven at this level, not really a player that you have a lot of like confidence in is going to be able to come in and immediately dominate. This is a player who's been in the tier 3 scene, the CLOL, and the ACL scene for quite a while. Never really stood out or like super impressed me. I think that there were some moments that we saw, especially in the fall playoffs, which I had to go and watch just to get some like recent tape from Munchie, where you're like, okay, I can see the idea here, but I think if there is a concern with Blue Otter, and the reason they come in at number 6 and not at number 5, because I really wanted to put this team at number 5, is there's like a real shot that Munchie is the weakest jungler in the entire league. I think that can be hidden a bit by the fact that your laners are solid, and that Rovex is hopefully going to be moving around the map and kind of protecting him a bit more in terms of the way you want to play these games, but Munchie can be taken advantage advantage of in the jungle. And if there are going to be a lot of situations where you're losing jungle pressure, Samikin's not an aggressive laner. He's not going to be able to pull resources back in the mid lane. Spawn is not an aggressive laner. He's not going to be able to pull resources back in the bot lane, at least consistently. Orianna can be an aggressive laner, but you can just focus topside if you're the enemy jungler, take Munchie and Orianna out. And I'm not really sure you have like the killer instinct on this team to pull it back. So if you have a concern with Blue Otter, it's that while the stability of this team is really high, the not the upside, because the upside is there, the like game-breaking potential of this team really relies on players that are a little bit lower in these rankings being better than I think they are. While I think you do have a lot of players that I trust them in ways for them to be the second or third best options. You need someone to emerge for me as the number one option. Maybe it is Samikin or Spawn. I don't expect it to be them. Samikin, I think, has a good shot of potentially being that, again, just because the mid lane pool is a little bit more exploitable right now. But I really want that to be Orianna on the top side, and if Rovex can be like a true top-tier roaming support here, or somebody that just plays for the 2v2 and allows Spawn to be in spots where he can carry in team fights, because he is a great 5v5 player, I think Blue Otter have a direction here. Jungle is a major question mark for me. Top lane kind of needs to be good for this team to be as good as they want, and again, I don't think you have exactly the most dynamic mid AD carry duo in the entire league, even if I think their baseline skill set is some of the highest in the NACL. All of that being said, if it does click, if you have the most stable mid AD carry in the entire league, and then you have a top side that's winning every single game because you can overload pressure on that side of the map, you're going to be winning every objective, you're going to be able to flank every single team fight, and Blue Otter is going to be a team that can compete to actually be in the top 4, which kind of feels untouchable for a lot of teams outside of the top 4 right now, and that is massive. So I do see the upside with this team. I just think that there is a universe where they're not this, and where they're closer to number 7 or number 8 in terms of these rankings, because jungle might not be all that good, because topside could be rough. We saw what happened last year when Low Jazz was in here as the starting jungler. Kryra obviously came in. I don't want to say fix the team, but Kryra is an LCS caliber jungler, and he came in and really elevated them. They're going to need, Munchie to be closer to Kryra than he was to Low Jazz, and I think that is a major question. But again, I just want to be optimistic because the idea of this team could be really, really fun. Then moving on to number 5 in my power rankings, and this is a team that obviously has some question marks about them, but at least from a floor perspective, I think I'm higher on them than most. It's Citadel Gaming coming in at number 5 for me, the top of this cluster. Again, number 5 to number 8, truly, whatever order you want. I know some people have CCG at 5 and Citadel at 8, right? Just because I have them flipped doesn't mean that I'm really all that far off from that opinion. Honestly, I'm pretty close to that. Just in general, in terms of where my rankings are at, the difference between number 5 and number 8 in terms of my grades, they're basically identical. Like, you can honestly swap almost anybody in that group, put them in any order you want, and it'll be relatively reasonable. But for me, Citadel or Old Missadel or whatever you want to call them in terms of how this roster is constructed is the team that for me is coming in at number 5 with the floor that they potentially have to offer. There are 2, maybe 3 players on this team that I just feel really good about, and honestly, I think the players that even I'm a little more concerned about, I still feel okay in general about the way that they are going to perform here in Tier 2. Their lineup is looking like Bradley in the top lane, Griffin in the jungle, Asila in the mid lane, Array at AD carry, and Stray at support. Obviously, there's only one quote-unquote returning member of this team from last year, and that is Bradley, but he's role-swapping up to the top side here, going back to top lane after multiple years back in mid lane. He started as mid laner, went top lane, went back mid, now is back top. Unfortunately for Bradley, I think he's realizing that if he's going to make the LCS, it's probably going to be through top lane. I will say, though, starting the conversation with Bradley, I don't want to overreact to generally what, Bradley was a long time ago, because it's been a while since he played top lane in the NACL. I will say, when he was playing top lane in the NACL many years ago, he was the number 1 top laner in the NACL. This guy was dominating that position and really, really a big threat in that role. It was him and I believe Tenacity at the time that were really just doing incredibly well for themselves. It could have been a different player. I remember there was like a big 2 on the top side. I believe it was Bradley and Tenacity, but he was a really good top laner when he was playing in that position. The question is, can he get that back now that he's role swapping back? I thought he was a good mid laner last year, and he's been pretty solid over the past couple of years in terms of being, your stock standard, like, can pop off in the right moment, is a good team fighter, can have a good laning performance, but isn't exactly the most dominant mid laner in the entire universe, is not somebody that I would consider a top 1 or 2 guy, but would probably be around the number 4 mid laner right now. If he can be a top 2 or 3 top laner again, that completely changes the idea of Citadel, and that is a huge upside piece for me in terms of why I like this team, because Bradley really has been a fantastic top laner in the past. Very different meta now than maybe it was when he was playing, a couple of years ago for Team Liquid Academy, but I still think he can be a very successful player in that role, and I think even the floor there is really high. He was a really good mid laner at an absolute floor. I think top lane is probably a more difficult position right now in the NACL, ironically enough, but I do think that he has even more upside top than he did mid lane, just because we've seen it be a little bit better in that role. So Overall, really like the swap for Bradley. I think this gives him some upside that he didn't necessarily have the past couple of years, just because he can be, fine enough as a mid laner. We didn't necessarily see those big breakthrough games, even though he would have some good performances. It always just felt like he was gated a little bit. And now I think you're pairing him with a couple of really interesting players. The other player I just feel great about here is Array. I don't really understand why people are low on this guy. Like, I don't know what else he has to prove as an AD carry at this level. I think Array really is him, like in terms of just being a super stable, strong AD carry player. It feels like every single year we have the same conversation where people are like, Ray's like the 6th or 7th best AD carries, maybe top 5 if you're feeling generous, and then he goes out there and performs over and over again. I get that the bot lane situation might scare you off a bit, but Array comes in for Blue Otter after Chrome ends up not playing for a majority of the summer split, and he's awesome for that team. He's genuinely a big piece on why they ended up getting 3rd last split. I think that bot lane was really underrated and undervalued in terms of how good they were. And Array just continues to be a piece that I really like. I think Bradley and Array are definitely really good, stable pieces for this team, and if you're building around them, that's a really good core. I think Bradley can win isolated on the top side or play weak side, as we know, and Array is also very flexible as an AD carry, can kind of do a little bit of whatever you want. If you had him as a top 2 AD carry right now, I don't think I'd really be all that against that. I'm really just that high on Array, and I think he's always been that good, going back to the Golden Guardians days. I really just think that this guy has always been undervalued by a majority of the community. Then you start talking about the rest of the pieces here. We'll talk about Stray last, because I think that's an interesting conversation that also gives this team a bit more upside than they're necessarily getting credit for. But Griffin and Asyla as the mid-jungle duo here. Griffin obviously has been around the scene for a very long time. He's coached, he's played, he's done a little bit of everything. He's had multiple name swaps, whatever you want to say. Solid enough jungler. I think he prefers, from what I've seen, to be in more of a facilitative type of role. That means Asyla is probably going to take a more aggressive role out of the mid lane here, and I think that makes sense for both of these players. I think if you are a little bit lower on Citadel, it's probably this mid-jungle duo that you are lower on. I have them both coming in at number 6 in their role. I think Griffin offers you a bit of a floor in terms of macro and stability. I think he's a good shot caller, and generally I think we've seen teams that have Griffin as the starting jungler be relatively good from a macro perspective in previous years. Obviously the coaching I think plays into that in a similar vein, but he's going to kind of need to be a pretty big macro piece on this team. I'm not quite sure Stray is going to be super comfortable doing that out of the support position right now, and you need your support and your jungler to be very vocal and very active in terms of the way that the meta is currently playing. So I am putting a lot of faith that Griffin's just going to be able to translate that again, but he's shown the ability to be able to do that in the past, so I feel okay about him doing it here. And then for Asyla in the mid lane, hopefully he can really take that next leap. Again, I think mid lane's really wide open right now. You're talking about players in this range like Many, like Aljun, like Conveying that we talked about for Winthrop. Like, can Asyla be better than those players? Yeah, he can be better than those players, but I just don't think we've seen the consistency come out of him just yet, especially in big moments. There have definitely been times where his laning has just not necessarily been up to snuff. He can make some mistakes in the later part of the game. I think that there are like small bits and pieces in basically every part of the game that he kind of needs to clean up and get better at, as we saw when he was playing for, Supernova, or the Ole Miss Supernova version that we got at the beginning of last year. But, a solid enough mid laner, and I think he has just as good of a chance as any other mid laner in this group of being able to break out as Aljun or as Many or as Zero or, even as Conveying. Like, I think he's kind of in that cluster, and I don't think they're really all that different. They have different ways that they get there, but in terms of the expected result, I think they're all kind of in the same bucket. And then there's Stray, and I actually do have some excitement for Stray role swapping to support. He's a smart player. He's always been a really good weak side top laner, and he understands exactly when he needs to pressure out versus when he needs to back off. Like, that has always been, a really big strength of his game. I think he can make the transition. Support is a position that I think has kind of needed some more aggressive talent coming into it for a little while. Not to say that the players in the NACL are too passive, but I think a lot of players in the NACL are too passive in the support position. I think Stray is the kind of player that theoretically could make an impact. If him and Array are good on the bottom side, and if you do have some upside here, you could be getting a really good bot lane going here. And I think if Stray is going to be more of a roamer, I think that can also work for this team. I would imagine it takes some time for him to get comfortable and to get used to playing down on the bottom side of the map. But, I think there is upside here in terms of like the mentality that he plays with and what he's shown in previous years for Ole Miss and for Supernova, obviously. So for Stray, I'm hopeful that he's going to be good. I feel really good about Array, and I feel really good about Bradley, quite frankly, going to the top side. If this mid-jungle is okay, like as long as they're not like bottom 3 in terms of the mid-jungle duos in the league, I think this team is going to be like a top 6 team in the league, because I just trust the side lanes a lot in terms of how they're going to play out. Even if Array is not generating massive leads because Stray is struggling in the early game, I think Array is such a consistent team fighter at playing from behind that it should be fine. Again, if this team's macro is okay, if Griffin can kind of carry a big role and a big load there, and if Asyla can actually be the the mid laner that breaks out of the middle here. I think Citadel has a decent chance of being a team that competes around this number 5 spot. I don't know if they have the same kind of upside that other teams in this group have. I think teams like Blue Otter or maybe even a CCG have higher upside if everything were to click. Like, best case scenario for all 3 of those teams is probably Citadel being the weakest of them, but I think their floor is higher than those other teams. I think that there is less that has to go right for Citadel for them to be competitive from my perspective. You are still hoping that you can get, good performances out of Stray, and maybe Bradley can be that top guy, but even if you don't get that, I think this team will be competitive, and I think Citadel should at the very least be a hard out and one of the better teams here in the middle of the pack. But now we get to move on to my top 4, and this is where things, I think, start to get a little bit more established. I do think there is a tier jump here. Still one more tier jump to go at the end of this video, but numbers 3 and 4 for me are going to be my B tier in today's video. Again, as a reminder, 9 and 10 were my D tier, 5 through 8 were my C tier, all in that same cluster. Now I think we're jumping up to B tier. These are teams that I think theoretically could win the league or could be contenders, but I think aren't quite as much favorites as they are, good teams that have some potential to break through. And for me, that starts at number 4 with Supernova coming in at this 4th spot. I really like the way that this team is constructed. These rankings aren't super favorable towards them in terms of what they could be, but again, that should go to show that the upside on this roster is massive. We're talking about a team that, was really good last year, that went in a completely different direction in 2026 with like a completely overhauled roster. But I think you have a lot of complementary pieces on this team and some of the best individual talent in the entire league in this roster. So I'm really excited to go over it. I know you're hoping for some bounce backs from some individual players, but there are some players here that are kind of still in their peak. And if you can get those bounce backs, like, you genuinely could be looking at a top 1 or 2 team if everything were to go right. Their lineup is looking like Hoarder in the top lane, Music in the jungle, Shochi in the mid lane, Levitate at AD carry, and Zyko at support. Obviously, there are some great pieces on this team. Hoarder, technically the only player that is returning from Supernova last year. It looked like he was going to be the starting top laner for NRG, but then Zamudo became available, and all of a sudden Hoarder became available because Zamudo was now on NRG. So Supernova are the ones to get to benefit from the fact that Hoarder was available. And quite frankly, I'm not quite sure how the offseason went. I'm not super plugged in terms of like, when decisions were made or who got their roster completed first or anything like that. Supernova is going to be one of the last teams that ends up announcing their roster. They still haven't officially announced by the time that this video ends up coming out. I just can't really delay this video any longer, but if this is like, oh, we just got the best players who were teamless, what a ridiculous haul for Supernova, because there's a lot of pieces on this team that I think it's ridiculous. We're teamless. Hoarder, obviously chief among them, wasn't originally supposed to be, but he is like a breakthrough top laner that I think theoretically could win MVP, right? Like, he's the kind of player that has the upside to be good enough to be an MVP caliber player, to be right up there with Zamudo, to be, right up there with Sniper, who we're going to talk about a bit later, players with LCS caliber, gameplay, LCS experience. Sniper's been to Worlds. Zamudo should have LCS experience. It's obviously not his fault that he doesn't necessarily have that going for him at the current moment, but Hoarder, he's up there in terms of that talent. He comes in as my number 3 top laner. I really do think he is that good in terms of what he can be, and for Supernova to be able to retain him on this team is absolutely massive. He's a carry-oriented player, but if he needs to play weak side, he can do that as well. Decently flexible. I just think he's awesome. His mechanics are excellent. His ability to play team fights, really strong. I think he's strong both early and late. He's kind of just a really good top laner that's developed into somebody that can even, grow a little bit more in terms of his ability to dominate the 1v1 in good matchups. There are times where I wish he would, be a little bit more aggressive in terms of how he played out those counter picks on the top side, but, you don't have to save counter pick for Hoarder. He can basically do whatever you need to do in almost any matchup. Overall, I just really like him as a player. And him getting retained here by Supernova is absolutely massive. He's one of the biggest pieces in the entire league, and to be able to bring him back, I think, is definitely a huge win. The other player I really want to talk about here is Zyko in the support position. How is Zyko, not on a top-tier team at this point? I continue to be super confused by the fact that players like Scary Jerry and Zyko are even in tier 2 at all. What else does he have to prove in terms of being a support? This guy has been consistently phenomenal every single year that he's played in the NACL, especially ever since the breakout in year 2 on Maryville. He just continues to be a high-end prospect that makes every team he plays for better, and he doesn't get the credit for that. He's played with so many AD carries that have gone on to make LCS appearances, and yet somehow, someway, Zyko, who's kind of the similar piece between all of those experiments, never really gets the credit he deserves. To me, he's the best support in the NACL. This guy can do a little bit of everything. His laning is excellent. He can be one of the more dominant 2v2 players if he's asked to be in the entire league. His ability to roam and create fights is phenomenal, and his creative instincts, his flanking instincts and team fights, really, really great as well. I don't have any negatives to really give Zyko, especially for a tier 2 player. I've really just been hoping and praying that he gets the tier 1 call up for quite a while now. Maryville obviously choose to go in a different direction. I'm not exactly anti that, as you can probably tell by the fact that they're not on this list just yet. But Zyko, I think, really is still the best support, or at least the highest floor support in the entire league. I would be entirely stunned if he was anything other than an all-pro caliber player for this roster, because that's what he's been throughout his entire time in the NACL. For Supernova to be able to get him is a big, big win. I want to talk about Music next, because I think he's another player that does add a little bit of a floor to this team that makes me excited. Music is kind of known for some very specific things, most notably his aggression and his shot calling. I think those are two very valuable traits, obviously, to bring to the jungle position. And really, what I think I'm really excited about when it comes to Music is I think a player like Shochi in the mid lane, who we are going to talk about, is like the perfect mid laner for Music individually as a player. Because when I think of Music, sometimes I think of him getting into too many like negative situations for being too far forward or for not connecting with the rest of his team. Shochi is one of the more selfless mid laners in the NACL in terms of, wanting to shove and roam. He's a very good laner and he can generate his own advantages, but what I really, have credited Shochi with is that basically every single jungler he plays with plays infinitely better, with him. Like, it's just the way that it goes. He makes every jungler look fantastic that he gets to play with, and I think Music is really not going to be an exception to that. I've been a little bit lower on Music throughout his time in the NACL. I think he is a good player. I think that there can be times where he makes mistakes in the later part of the game that end up really costing his team. I think that we've seen some moments where he's not always in the right place at the right time, and for him to be such a vocal leader and to not always make the correct call can sometimes be a bit concerning. We've seen some of his teams really struggle with that in the past, but again, I think this is basically a perfect landing spot for a player of Music's caliber, and best case scenario, this guy can be one of the best junglers in the NACL. I think his floor is around 5th, like around average. If that's your floor as a jungler at this level, that's pretty darn good. But then we get into, I don't want to say some bounce back candidates, but some players that I think have some more to prove. Starting with Shochi in the mid lane, already talked a bit about him. We know playstyle wise what Shochi is going to be. He can play things like Akshan, and I remember the Tryndamere game from many years ago that he was playing on Fear. Like, we know he can be more of a selfish player if he needs to be in terms of the ability to generate resources and kind of pop off in big moments. But what I know Shochi for is shoving and roaming and playing for his jungler, and that's what he does better than any other mid laner at this level. Spyrax is really the only other player who can do that at that caliber, and I don't think Shochi gets enough credit for that. And especially when you look at the mid lane landscape right now in the NACL, can you tell me that Shochi is definitively worse than Samikin or Aljun or Phi Mini or Asyla? Like, Shochi to me is a player that I think offers and adds more value to a team than a lot of those players, and that's why he comes in as my number 3 mid laner. I don't necessarily feel comfortable having him as like a B+, A- caliber player. There was a time on Fear when him and Perry were linked up where I was kind of hoping that an LCS team would, come out and say, hey, we want to take a risk on you guys. We want to bring you up here to tier 1 and see what can happen as a duo. I don't necessarily think that that's where Shochi's career arc has led him towards, but he was really good on Dorado last year. I think he gets undervalued for what he was on CCG and even on this Supernova team before he got replaced by Toasty a couple of years ago. I think he's just consistently been a floor raiser for every team that he's gone towards, and I think that that's going to be very similar here, and especially, again, with a weaker mid lane landscape in terms of how tier 2 is broken down. I think Shochi can still be one of the more mechanically talented mid laners while also not needing a ton of babysitting in the early game to get there, which I think is a very valuable combination right now for mid laners. So I really like Shochi, and I really like his pairing with Music. I think that's going to be a dangerous mid jungle duo. And then there's Levitate on the bottom side, and if I could lock in and feel very comfortable on Levitate being the version of himself that he was in 2024, this is an entirely different conversation, because 2024 Levitate, I was going to bat and saying okay, in terms of consistency and aggression and mechanics, I think this guy can be a top 3 player in the league. He could win MVP in the NACL, and then the bottom really fell out from under him in 2025. It just did not work out for him, and obviously, for a variety of different reasons, that is concerning, but I think for the most part, his laning just got significantly worse. One of the things I'm really excited about with this team, and one of the reasons why I think you can be really optimistic about Levitate down on the bottom side, is that he gets to pair up with Zyko in the support position. Zyko is one of the best supports in the entire league for being able to get the best out of their AD carry. We've seen it with Scary Jerry. We've seen it with Sajed. We've seen it consistently out of Zyko, that he's able to get a lot of consistency out of the laning phase and then transition that into free setups in a lot of the late game team fights. if you can do that for somebody who's as mechanically talented as Levitate is, like, we could once again be talking about him as a top 1 or top 2 AD carry in the league in terms of production. It was just a really bad year last year, and you're hopeful that he's going to be able to turn it around. But you can see the upside here. It is clear that we've made a jump in terms of where the talent is on this team. Supernova has true upside to be one of the better teams in the league, to compete for promotion, and to be a team that genuinely scares a lot of, like, you know, top tier teams in this league. I just think that they have more to prove, right? Levitate has to bounce back. Shochi, as much as he ranks as my number 3 mid laner, hasn't exactly been a game breaker over the past couple of years. Music is not somebody that I'm super convinced is dominant, and you want to see players like Hoarder and Zyko be able to carry the load outside of the systems that, you know, were really in place to make them good in the first place. Hoarder, I think, is coming off of a really good year, but he had more consistent talent surrounding him, like Scary Jerry, like Dardoch in the jungle, you know, very different pieces there. And Zyko's never been outside of the Maryville system, at the very least, in terms of, like, you know, not counting Dark Zero, in terms of the NACL, and you're just hopeful he can still make it work there. Like, there are question marks there, but to me, if it all hits, like, this is a team that genuinely can compete, and that's why I think there is a clear jump. If they want to be a top 2 team, it's really not going to be all that, you know, difficult for them to get there. I really like the way that they constructed everything here. But then moving on to number 3 in my power rankings, and this is going to be the top of my B tier, which I think is going to surprise and, I don't know, maybe upset quite a few people, because this team is kind of being earmarked for being like a true title contender. I just have some question marks right now from a floor perspective. It's NRG coming in at number 3 for me, coming in at the top of B tier, not quite in that A tier for me. I really like NRG, and I think there is a world where they just win the league, where they're the best team, where they can do everything, but I have some concerns. There are just so many questions about what happens with this team moving forward in terms of, do they have the talent day number 1 to be able to make that work? And I think for me, I'm going to kind of side onto the proven quantities of the top 2 teams a little bit more than I'm going to side on the upside of NRG for now. Again, the upside is definitely there, and we're going to really get into it here and kind of talk about these players and, you know, talk about why I think there is a chance that this team is just number 1 from day number 1. But at least for now, I'm going to bet that they're going to run into at least a couple of, you know, learning moments and a couple of roadblocks in the way before, you know, we eventually try and see this team potentially at their best later on in the year. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Zamudo in the top lane, Kizno in the jungle, Mini and Ciro in the mid lane, Ciro Nai. I don't really have a ton to say about Ciro Nai. You know, obviously, I'll touch on him a little bit because he's been announced as a member of this team. I believe he's just mostly a backup. I think Mini is going to be playing for the most part here, but I will definitely include him in the conversation. Sushi at AD carry and Spica role swapping to support. Obviously, quite a bit to talk about here in terms of NRG, and when you want to talk about the floor and, like, why you would be excited about this team being number 1, it's Zamudo and Kizno on the top side. I think that that's a really easy way to talk about this team. Zamudo does come in for me as my number 1 top laner. I will say, I like Zamudo a lot. Like, I'm certainly not trying to say that I don't like Zamudo under any stretch. I do think that there is this notion that Zamudo is leaps and bounds better than any top laner in the NACL, and while I think that there is a good chance that that is true, I think there is also some risk here that people aren't necessarily talking about. While he's been super dominant in Tier 2 before, the system with which he's been super dominant within is very different on this NRG team than maybe it was on Maryville or on Dark Zero last year, right? It's just a completely different kind of system in terms of, you know, what he has been asked to do. Zamudo has never done anything other than be, like, strong side top lane. He has never had to play weak side. He has never done anything other than be, like, super involved in the way that his jungler plays the game. And while I do think there's a pretty good chance that they end up doing the same thing here on NRG, one of my big concerns for Lion, and one of the big reasons why I was a little bit nervous about Zamudo being thrust into that position with Inspired, with, you know, Saint on that team at the beginning of the year when I talked about, you know, what I thought their offseason looked like. One of the big reasons why I was concerned is that Zamudo has not proven that he can be a weak side top laner at all, like at any level. Even at the Tier 2 level, this guy was not a good weak side top laner. He was a below average top laner at playing weak side when he was asked to do it. It's just not really what he's asked to do all that much. And, you know, the big concern for me is that Zamudo has really only ever played with Yuji. And Yuji is phenomenal, but I think Yuji's better than Zamudo in terms of, like, the player grades that I would give out. And I'm not saying that Zamudo is going to fail. In fact, I still have him as number 1. Like, again, like, I'm not trying to, you know, rag on Zamudo. I think he's by far the most mechanically talented top laner, and if he's left to his own devices in a 1v1, he's going to win. He's going to take over games, and he's going to win MVP, just like he did last year. But I think that there is some inherent risk of saying, okay, this is a guy that we kind of have to play for on the top side because that's all he's ever really been as a top laner throughout his career. I just think that there are more downsides to that than people are willing to give him credit for. If you're willing to kind of opt into being the Zamudo show, I think it's going to be just fine. And I still think he can win MVP because he's going to be the highest resource top laner in the entire league. That's not really going to be a big question. But I do think it opens up some opportunity to criticize some of the rest of this team. Kisno is obviously the big other piece that people are talking about. People very obviously have him as the number 2 jungler in terms of a lot of their rankings. From what I've seen, it's Yuji and then Kisno in a lot of people's eyes. I have him at number 3 for me. I really like Kisno. Like, don't get me wrong, I certainly have no negativity towards Kisno. He stepped in for DSG and looked fantastic. I think we're just forgetting how good Tomio was last year, or maybe we're just underrating how good Tomio was last year in terms of the NACL, like the full split that we got in tier 2. Tomio was clearly better than Kisno from my perspective, and again, I like Kisno. I think there are a lot of tier 2 junglers that would do well at the tier 1 level, but I think Kisno also has some things he needs to work on. He can be a big carry and he's aggressive in the early game, but I do worry about the surrounding pieces here. Again, Zamudo is somebody that does want quite a few resources. Yuji did a great job of basically saying, like, it's me and you versus the world, and the rest of our team is going to play weak side when they were playing with him last year. And obviously the year before it was, a little bit different as well. Zamudo on Dragonsteel was definitely very high resource as well, but Kisno, the kind of player that I think wants to be a bit more aggressive in terms of the way he plays his engages. Maybe that will work, but you're talking about a top laner who does want resources, a mid and bot lane that I think both have a lot to prove in terms of their laning phases, where I think they're probably going to be their weakest. Like, I don't think it's like a guarantee that Kisno comes in here and is as dominant as he was for DSG. I think it's a very different setup in terms of the way that this team plays, and so I really like Kisno, and obviously that stretch in tier 1 kind of gives you a lot of confidence that this guy is going to be able to have that big breakthrough MVP caliber year here in tier 2, but I also wouldn't be entirely surprised if it didn't quite line up exactly like that from day number 1, mostly because you're relying on a lot of other pieces here. Spica, I'm actually going to talk about first. Role swapping, obviously, to support. This is a historic jungler, somebody who's been to Worlds, who's been an MVP in the LCS before, role swapping down to support here. I really don't have a ton of worries. My biggest concern has more to do with Sushi than it does with Spica, and it's not that Spica is going to be bad in the support position, just rather I'm not really sure how good this 2v2 is going to be at the beginning of the year, because Sushi's not really a great 2v2 player. He's a phenomenal team fighter and his mechanics are excellent, but he's really not that dominant of a 2v2 player. He can sometimes fall behind in individual lanes, and Spica's not going to have a ton of matchup knowledge in comparison to other supports, or at least, we don't quite know what he's going to be as a 2v2 player. Oftentimes you see a lot of people who role swap to support be much more useful as roamers first before they become good laners, and I think that's probably going to be the case with Spica. And so I do think you fall into a position where the 2v2 could actually be a little bit more passive than maybe you would want out of the bottom side. Now, if you're going to play weak side more towards then, and Sushi's just going to kind of be on Jhin and Ezreal duty or, something like that, then I think that makes a little bit more sense. But then you're kind of limiting the upside of Sushi, who can be this dominant hyper carry towards the back end of games. I just think that there is some concern there. Spica needs to be, kind of an outlier in terms of his 2v2 ability early on as somebody role swapping to that role. I imagine he'll be fine. Again, not really somebody that I'm worried about in terms of the macro sense. He is a grinder. He's one of the smartest people in North America in terms of League of Legends. I don't worry about his ability to be able to pilot the role. It's more so how he fits specifically on this team, which I think transitions us nicely into Mini and Sushi, who, we're going to have a big conversation about. Sushi, I've already kind of talked about, more of a hyper carry player, somebody who feels more comfortable being kind of the main character on a team. We saw that when he was on Near Airport and he got a lot of resources and was able to carry in the back end of games. Spica clearly liking that experience, wanting to play with him again here on NRG. But more specifically on Dorado last year, I think what we saw is that when he was in a good position in the mid to late game, he looked awesome. When he wasn't, it was bad, because he can lose pretty hard in the 2v2. And when you're asking whether or not this team wants to babysit a bot lane, probably not. You want to play towards topside. You want to get Zamudo into those aggressive positions. But I think Kisno might be kind of forced to put more attention into Sushi, because Spica might not be able to bail him out and, keep him safe in the 2v2 nearly as much as, a more experienced support might be able to do in that particular spot. Again, I'm not trying to take anything away from the idea of this team. I just think that there are some real concerns, and I think Sushi, if he does turn into one of the best AD carries in the league, don't be surprised. This guy's mechanics are arguably one of one in terms of how he's able to take over games and team fights, but his laning absolutely has to get better, and I don't know if I feel super confident that that's going to happen day number 1. And then you've got Mini in the mid lane, who he did look good. I want to say he filled in, I believe, for Insanity for a couple of games on Luminosity last year, and obviously looked really good in those games. But when he was playing for AMI, obviously very different scenario, had a lot of missteps in the laning phase. Wanted to see him be a bit more aggressive in terms of the way he played a lot of those phases out. Again, very different, team situation. Didn't quite get to play with the same level of talent that he's going to get to play to here, but I'm not so sure he's going to be highly prioritized on this team. I think there's a chance that he's going to be asked and expected to be able to carry from day number 1, at least in terms terms of the 1v1, like be able to survive. And while, he comes in at number 5 for me as a mid laner, I do think he has a good chance of being able to do that in comparison to a lot of the other players that are in this role. Do I think he's going to be able to do that against the best mid laners in the league, like day number 1? It's just kind of a hard sell for me. And if you're not picking it up, like I really do think I'm just the lowest on energy and what their configuration looks like. I think the talent on this team is tremendous. Like it is insane. They probably have the most mechanical talent of any team in the NACL. And that I want to make abundantly clear when talking about this. When you're just talking about raw potential and raw talent, I think this team is number 1 in the entire league in terms of what they could be. I worry though about the way that these, skill sets go together. Kizno is going to have to take more of a back seat, more of a facilitative role on this team in order to maximize what you're getting out of a lot of these lanes. Sushi and Spica need to be able to survive in the 2v2. Zamudo is likely going to require a lot of resources on the top side, and I think people are just treating it as a given that he's going to be an MVP caliber player. And while I think he's got the best mechanics of anybody in the entire league, he needs a little bit more assistance to get that out of him. And again, Fimini and Sushi are question marks for me for this team. NRG just have too many things going against them for me to consider them for top 2 at the current moment. And honestly, if I had to put money on it, I think they're going to struggle in split number 1 more than people think they are. I don't think that they're going to be bottom half or anything like that. They're going to be a team that competes to be top 2 or top 3. But honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if this team was in 4th place for a lot of the beginning of this year with a team like Supernova, potentially even being better than them early on. I think NRG are in the same tier as them, and I think they're going to have to prove that they're not a lot of the things that I worry about if they're going to be number 1. That being said, again, I want to make it clear, talent-wise, they can and should really be the number 1 team. And if they end up coming out here and Sushi and Spica are winning in the 2v2 and Fimini is super stable in the mid lane and Kizno doesn't even need to go top lane in order for Zamudo to take over games, all of that is fantastic. I just want to take a wait-and-see approach on a team that I think could theoretically run into some struggles. Then moving on to number 2 in my power rankings, and this to me is a tier up. This is my A tier. The top 2 teams for me in the NACL are the 2 threats to not only win the league, but I think these are the 2 teams that have enough talent to, like, best case scenario, promote up to LCS. I wouldn't say that either are favorites with how good Disguised has looked so far in the LCS in terms of how they've played, but I think if there were going to be teams that have the upside to do it, I think it's probably these 2. NRG can kind of be considered a part of that, but I think they're kind of like, a B+ team for me. I think the A tier is like the title favorites. And I think it's because these players just have game-breaking talent at multiple different positions. For me, coming in at number 2, though, it is going to be Maryville University. It's going to be a team that kind of loses their spot in a weird way, with Dark Zero kind of selling it to NRG and then re-qualifying through Maryville now that they are no longer Dark Zero or Dragonsteel or any of these other partnerships that they've gone through. They are, once again, just representing the university as Maryville and representing themselves up on the NACL stage. And quite frankly, I think that they should be genuine contenders to win the entire league. I'm honestly surprised that it doesn't really seem like a lot of people are on that same wavelength in terms of their rankings. I think that this team is awesome, and I don't really know what they're lacking. I think that there are some concerns about what these players can do at a top tier level, but I think some of the negatives that people give this team, I just don't necessarily personally agree with. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like K in the top lane, Yuji in the jungle, Spyrax in the mid lane, Scary Jerry at AD carry, and Obstinatus at support. There are a lot of pieces here that obviously Maryville fans are going to be familiar with. The core of UG, Spyrax, and Scary Jerry, a very comfortable core for Maryville fans, and that is the lead of the optimism here is you have 2 players that I think you could consider 2 of the best players in the entire league. To me, Yuji is still the best player in the NACL. I understand that he didn't have a great run on Team Liquid, but all this guy has ever been is the best player in Tier 2. There's no reason to believe that that is going to change, especially going back to a very familiar environment with players that he's played with before. Yuji is unbelievable. He's the only player that I give an A+ grade in terms of his NACL like potential and overall ability. Like, I just think this guy can do everything. He can be the best facilitator in the jungle. He can be super aggressive in terms of being able to strangle out opponents with the invades and with the ability to take away resources. He's an unbelievably good skirmisher. He's a really good late game team fighter. Like, there's no weakness to Yuji's game. Genuinely, the only reason that he's even playing for Maryville is because of the weird situation when it comes down to what region he's actually representing and the import status that he would have in either North America or Europe. Outside of that, this guy is absolutely, like, not only a tier 1 player, but, like, you know, even on Team Liquid, we saw some flashes where it's like, okay, this guy can be a game breaker. I was so pissed off at basically every team in the LCS for not bringing Yuji in, because I don't care that the guy struggled a little bit on day number 1 on a team that had a lot of problems elsewhere. I just want to see this guy get an actual tier 1 opportunity. For now, he comes in as my number 1 jungler, and it's not particularly close. Again, I really do like players like Tomio and Kizno, but Yuji is better than both of them in terms of what he has been at tier 2, and I think he's the best player in the league. And that is the biggest biggest reason why Maryville, to me, is bare minimum like an A tier team, a top tier team. I think you can't have a player of UG's quality and like of his talent level and not be a threat to win the league. Like, I just don't believe that that is ever going to be the case with someone who's as good as UG is. And you have the best AD carry in the league in Scary Jerry. Another player that I'm really not sure what we are missing in terms of like tier 1 talent. I get that he had a run on DSG and it didn't quite go according to plan, but he got better game over game over game. He went back down to tier 2 at the end of last year and played for Supernova and was the best AD carry in the league throughout basically all of the regular season. You can talk about Supernova kind of underperforming in the playoff run, not making the promotion tournament, being a team that had all these expectations and couldn't necessarily live up to it. Scary Jerry was not the problem on that team by any stretch, and all he did throughout all of 2025 was prove that he is still the best AD carry in tier 2 and that he probably deserves to be in tier 1. I was also frustrated in my offseason grades video that nobody took a chance on Scary Jerry in that same vein as Zyko and Yuji and all these players to come out of the Maryville system that have been good for such a long time. This guy's mechanics are excellent. He's gotten better every single year, and the only exception to that is maybe last year, but one of the things I always praise Jerry for is that he is a grinder. He's clearly somebody who is like really dedicated on being the best AD carry he can possibly be, and I think he's taken a lot of the last couple of years with like a chip on his shoulder. That's what I would expect, and I think he's going to come out here and be like a true MVP, like front runner or favorite in that, you know, regard. If you're playing with the best player in the league in the jungle position in UG, and I think you're an AD carry that has probably the best mechanics and certainly the best track record of any ADC in the league, like, yeah, I mean, that's bare minimum a top 2 team. Like, there's no way you could convince me that they are lower than that, even with just those 2 players. Like, even if you didn't like the rest of this team, which I do, I like the rest of this team. So we can talk about them here. Spyrax making, I guess, his return to pro play after a break in summer of last year. Like, happy to see him back. He's a jack of all trades mid laner that definitely deserves to be in this spot. He obviously pairs up really well with UG, as we've seen for years and years and years in the FlyQuest system, in Maryville, like wherever. It does not matter. These two have always played well together, and it's because of their complementary playstyles. UG, much more of a main character, wants to be the guy that really controls the pace of the game and, you know, it wants to win that MVP award. Spyrax, somebody who is really good at being that facilitative type of mid laner that wants to shove and roam, that wants to play really stable in the mid lane and then, you know, be able to team fight at a really high level. Spyrax to me is the pinnacle of consistency, and he comes in as my number 2 mid laner in a league where there's really only 2 established great mid laners. I think Spyrax is a part of that, and I think he deserves to be considered amongst the upper echelon of mid laners, even if he's not exactly the biggest standout player. There were times last year where he was even more impressive in the spring split in terms of the plays he was going for and making. So, you know, I feel great about Spyrax coming in and being the mid laner here. We'll talk about the other 2 players now. This is where some of the apprehension comes down for Maryville, but I'll start with Kay on the top side, of course, kind of staying with this team from the Dark Zero days last year. I'm just higher on what we saw out of Kay, I guess, than a lot of other people are. I thought this guy was pretty good last year, especially out of lane. His team fighting was really consistent, and he can make a big impact on games. He just needs to make sure he doesn't fall behind as consistently as he did in bad matchups, because they would have to kind of save protection picks for him towards the end of draft, which you don't really want to do. You don't want to have to rely on counter pick for topside, but he already showed a ton of development in that area, like towards the back end of last year, and mechanically speaking, it is very clear that this guy is good enough to generate his own leads and his own advantages, even without a lot of intervention. I think that there were a lot of games where Kay just kind of walked out and it was like, oh, like you are one of the better top laners in tier 2. Now, again, top lane has gotten better in the offseason because you've had players like Zamudo and Sniper come down into the league, and so he's naturally going to get bumped down, but last year, I think he was like a borderline top 3 top laner in the NACL, and we're talking about him as a weak link on Maryville. That's a pretty darn good weak link, especially because you don't really have to use resources in-game to protect him if you get him in a good matchup. And then the big question mark for a lot of people is Obstinatus in the support position, but for me, it's not really a big question mark. I've been watching the NLC for a pretty long time, and Obstinatus has obviously been a pretty good support in the NLC for a good amount of time over in Europe. And, you know, to import him, for him to come in here and get to pair up with Scary Jerry, I think this is a phenomenal pairing. I would have preferred Zyko was still here on this team just because I think Zyko is that good, but Obstinatus is, you know, not a player that I think you could consider a weak link. The only negative I can give him is that he's much more playmaker-minded than maybe Zyko is. Zyko definitely much more there to help the AD carry and to be somebody that finds creative angles later on in games. Obstinatus wants to play Rakan and wants to play Leona, wants to play Nautilus, wants to be an engaged threat that can roam around, but what that means is that maybe him and Scary Jerry can generate small leads in the 2v2, and then UG can just take over the game with Obstinatus, finding ways to engage as well. Spyrax is going to be happy to shove and roam and play for the macro game. I don't look at Obstinatus at all as a weak link, as somebody who's watched him for a while in Tier 2, or obviously in the NLC over in Europe. I think K had showed some really great things. I think this guy mechanically is right up there, and I think you're looking at the best jungle mid AD carry trio in the entire league. I don't see a weakness here with Maryville. Again, the only thing that can really hold them back is this idea that they haven't really proven that they can do it as this group. I think that there are some concerns that the mental on some of these players that probably wanted to be in Tier 1 at the start of the year is not great. Like UG and Scary Jerry are Tier 1 caliber. If they can play up to their own standard, that's not going to be a problem. Obstinatus obviously is not a huge enchanter player, at least from my knowledge of him. He's not somebody who's really gone and wanted to play more for the 2v2. That can be a bit of a problem for Jerry. K also, you know, you're just hopeful that you can repeat those performances. He did have a couple of bad games, and again, he'll make some bad plays in lane that can get him behind for basically no reason. But if those are the weaknesses that we're talking about in comparison to the other teams that we brought up here, to me, Maryville is bare minimum top 2. And honestly, I think you can make an incredibly solid case that Maryville should be the team to beat, like the #1 team in the NACL if you really wanted to make it. But that's going to bring us to #1 in my power rankings, and by process of elimination, you know who is here at the #1 spot. It's going to be kind of the consensus #1 team. I think for a lot of people, for me, it's going to be Conviction coming in at #1, and I'm not going to go against the grain here as much as I really wanted to put Maryville #1, because I think that there is a better chance than basically anybody else out there is giving them at being the best team in the league. I think Conviction has to be considered the team to beat right now, just because I think their consistency across the board is higher than any other team. There are still question marks. No team in the NACL has no question marks. I think there are parts of this roster that you do get a bit concerned about, but for the most part, I feel very good about Conviction, and I'm even higher on this team in a couple of key areas, and that's why I ended up settling on #1 for them. So let's get into it. Their lineup is looking like Sniper in the top lane, Tomio in the jungle, Insanity in the mid lane, Meech at AD carry, and Breezy at support. You're obviously bringing over a lot of players who found a lot of success last year, and players that obviously were, you know, very highly prioritized in years past. We're going to start with the jungle mid duo here. I think that that's the main place for me to bring my optimism. You know, this is the best mid jungle duo in the league. I don't think there's really a lot of argument about that. I mean, UG and Spyrax are going to be in that conversation, but I don't think any other team even has an argument for this. I think Tomio is somehow still incredibly underrated. It's almost as if this guy just, like, you know, had one bad split in the LCS and it just completely ruined his reputation on what he could be. I get it, man. He likes to be a facilitator. He wants to play Maokai and Sejuani, and not everybody's going to like that style. Not everybody wants him to be more passive and more team-oriented, but he finds success all the time on these champions, regardless of if they're in meta or not. They weren't particularly in meta last year, and this guy was still having a ton of success on Luminosity with those picks. I think it's kind of a little bit ridiculous to see this guy ranked as anything lower than the second best jungler in the league. Like, I love Kizno. I really do. I think that guy looked awesome on DSG, but Tomio was better than Kizno all of last year, at least in terms of my perception of the tempo and the way he played the map. I thought he was excellent on Luminosity, was arguably the best player on that team for large portions of last year, and, you know, I think it's a bit disrespectful to put him third, at least in my opinion. I think he's going to come out and prove that. He's very stable, and I think what I really like about his ability to be more of a facilitator on this team is that it does give more room for a lot of these more aggressive players to be more aggressive. Meech wants to be a main character. You know, Sniper wants to be a main character. You can give these guys the freedom to be more active and more aggressive on the map when you're basically saying, I'm there to make sure that you look as good as possible. That's what Tomio has always been really good at. I continue to think that he deserves an LCS spot. I think him and Insanity right now would be an upgrade to multiple LCS mid-jungle duos. You know, as this video is basically going out, Dignitas kind of announced that they are partnering up with Conviction. I don't know, man. Tomio and Insanity would be an upgrade to Dignitas's mid-jungle duo right now. They would genuinely just be better. I think they're tier 1 caliber talent, and I think Tomio doesn't get that credit. I think Insanity does get that credit. He's very clearly the #1 mid laner in the NACL right now. I mean, he proved that last year on Luminosity. He had a slower start to the year on that team where he was kind of fine for a majority of spring, and then he popped off in the finals. And then obviously in summer, something happened where he was like, hey, can we play for me just like a little bit more? Like, instead of playing for bot lane or top side, can we just like make sure that I'm in a better spot? And he just went like nuclear in a lot of those games. He was absolutely massive, very clearly establishing himself as the #1 mid laner in the NACL. I've always liked Insanity. I was giving this guy all pro nods on TSM back in the day. Yeah, I've just really liked the way that he plays the game. I think even when he was a rookie many years ago on, I believe it was Immortals, you know, back in the day, I've always liked his game. I think he's very flexible with the way he plays, and him and Tomio have great chemistry as a mid-jungle duo because he can play low resource if he needs to, if Tomio wants to play for the side lanes, but also it's clear what happens when you do play for Insanity, which is that he can take over in 1v1s with any sort of lead, especially in a mid lane pool that I think is going to naturally be a bit weaker in lane. So I think this mid-jungle jungle duo is the best in the league, and that's probably why they established themselves as the #1 team. That's not it, though. I mean, Sniper is coming down from tier 1, from playing for 100 Thieves for the past couple of years, and I'm going to push back a bit on the Sniper negative train. I was like leading the Sniper negativity train for a little while there, because I think as a rookie, and when he was going to Worlds with 100 Thieves, I was really going like, hey guys, are we not watching these games? This guy's getting absolutely blasted, and then Quid is just kind of winning them team fights with River, and they're just like winning. You know what I mean? Like it's not necessarily like a good look, in my opinion, for Sniper in a lot of those instances. And then I do think that there was some progression made last year, although I think it was at the detriment of his confidence, and it was at the detriment of a lot of the like results. Like I think the results were much worse because he was kind of going through that process of trying to grow his game, but there were times where I thought he played a lot more stable on weak side, something I didn't really think he did at all when he was first playing for 100 Thieves. He was very volatile and a great team fighter, but he was at least trying to become a better weak side player at the tail end of last year before he got benched for Dokla. And I think there was some progress made in that direction. It just was too slow for a team that really wanted to make Worlds, and obviously it worked out for 100 Thieves. But I think Sniper can actually be a player that can compete to be the most consistent top player in the league. I love Zamudo, but I think that there is a chance that Zamudo is just more volatile than Sniper is, who I think has a very well-rounded game. I think people are too low on where Sniper is at right now. I think he looked better in tier 1 than he gets credit for, and I think he will be an asset to this team down here in tier 2. He comes in as my #2 top laner. And then we get to talk about the bot lane, and if there is a concern, it's probably the bot lane here. Breezy is not my concern. I think Breezy just played the best year of his career in 2025, and I don't know if that's a hot take, but Breezy was awesome last year. He was excellent in spring for CCG, where he didn't get nearly enough credit. I think he was arguably the best support in the entire league in the spring split. Wasn't quite as dominant on Supernova because he didn't really have to be, but he was still very good. To me, this is a top 2 support in terms of floor. I think we're looking at a guy who has been nothing but very good at this level, and at his best, he's been great. And I think if we're going to get that version of him linked up with someone like Tomio, that's terrifying. Tomio is going to be in every lane, and Breezy is a fantastic roamer, really big playmaker. The only real concern I have for this team is Meech in the AD carry role. Now, the conversation around Meech is interesting. He obviously wasn't playing last year in the NACL. He was originally supposed to be a part of that Nightmare roster. Didn't end up coming to fruition. That entire team ends up blowing up before the season even starts. But Meech was a player I was always lower on this channel, to be quite frank. Like going back to his days on CLG Academy, on DSG, then when he gets promoted to 100 Thieves. Like I don't think there's ever really been a time where I haven't been lower on Meech, and that's mostly because I think he kind of needs to be babysat as an AD carry. But I'll say, like, this is kind of a great team setup for him to be babysat as an AD carry. Breezy is very good at being able to guide ADCs through laning phase, and if Meech can get, gold leads in the early game, we know he can take over with his mechanics. I think Tomio is going to be happy to make sure his AD carry is in as good of a spot as possible. We saw that at times with Tactical last year, where he was just like, especially in the spring split, like, okay, Tactical, just go and take over. Go and dominate a lot of these games in the regular season. I think Meech will fill a very similar role for this team with Tomio, kind of linking up. Again, the only negative I have towards Meech is that I don't think he necessarily is all that good when isolated in the 2v2, and you don't really know where he's going to be considering he hasn't played at like top tier 2 competition in over a year. But if Meech is anything like what he was before, he's good enough for you to be able to win tier 2 with, for you to be able to win the NACL with. He's just a little bit more limited in terms of his skill set, but you have such a flexible team around him with players like Breezy, Tomio, Insanity, even Sniper, who's grown in flexibility, that you can kind of afford to have an AD carry that needs to be a little bit more, kind of the main character on a team, that needs to be, the one that you play for, because the rest of the team can sacrifice those resources and still be super useful in the later part of the game. So love the lineup here for Conviction. I love the way that their skill sets end up tying together. This is the thing I talk about with like Energy lower on the list. You can have a lot of talent, but you need to make sure that it's the kind of talent where the skill sets can come together and make the most of it. I think Conviction not only have the most amount of talent in the entire league, but I think that they pair up incredibly well in terms of the way that you look at this game. I can't even really give a stylistic problem for this team. The only negative is that I think Meech can't really, be a superstar on his own. I think we've seen that in tier 2, and I think there is some idea that Tomio might just be too slow of a jungler for this current meta, where you do want to skirmish so much in the early game. You're technically hoping for a bounce back from Sniper, but like these are minor concerns to me that I'm pretty easily able to dismiss because of the way that these guys have played. And I think anything other than Conviction kind of being the favorites this year does feel a bit off. I really like Maryville. I think there's an off chance that NRG and Supernova can be competitive, but for me, Conviction very clearly came in at #1 in these rankings and will kind of be considered this year's version of Luminosity, where they are very much the team to beat. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL Spring Split Primer video here in 2026. I really do hope you guys enjoyed. Obviously, we put a lot of time and effort into these Primer videos. I go back and watch basically every single one of these players, not only from last year, but a lot of their ACL stuff and anything they did in CLOL. Like, I want to make sure I have as clear of an identity on who these players are as possible. So really appreciate you guys sticking around and, let me know what you agree or disagree with. Obviously, I think I definitely have a couple of different opinions here. CCG being at 8, I think is a bit of a shocker. I think NRG being at 3, like a full tier below Maryville in conviction, I think is definitely, not exactly popular. Citadel being at 5, I'm sure is not particularly popular. So let me know what you agree with or disagree with. What do you think is right? What do you think is wrong? Down in the comments section below. Very curious to know your thoughts and opinions down there. But that's going to do it for today's video. If you enjoyed, click that like button. It really helps out the channel. It really does a lot more than you know. Helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. And of course, lets me know that you are enjoying the video in that same vein so I can make more content like this moving forward. If you are interested in NACL, just in general, we're going to be doing weekly recaps of every single game that happens during the regular season on this channel. So stick around for that. We, of course, also cover the LCS, the LEC, the LCK, and the LPL every single week. I'm still a caster for LPL English. You can find the links to that down in the description below. Obviously, go ahead and check that out if you want to hear my thoughts on not these games specifically, but LPL games live and just maybe the way that I process a lot of these high-level games in general. And go ahead and subscribe. Obviously, stick around for all those weekly recaps, all that awesome NACL goodness that's going to be coming for the rest of the year. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all